Thank you guys. I'm Bob Hassmiller, the hydrologist, district hydrologist, and I have some names down here. Mary Lou Welby, also a district hydrologist, sitting in the back, helped with this presentation and with the data collection. And then there's two others, Hazel Owens and Bryant Platt, who are seasonals, that helped out with the data collection and with coming up with the existing condition for this project. And right here, we're up at the Indian Rock Lookout, looking off at the headwaters of Big Creek. And basically what I want to point out is a big U-shaped valley that exists up in this headwater area. And like we heard from Hirsch, the geology and some of those processes really create the conditions for water and for deeper soils and really for cooler water, which supports some of the bull trout populations that exist up here that we'll hear more about as we proceed. So some of the objectives for this discussion, how I kind of grouped them, were physical inputs and processes, and then kind of framing that into depositional areas, and then going into past management activities and how that's affected water quality and some of the water quality issues that exist out there, and then also discussing some of the riparian conditions from some data collection that we did this past year. Like we heard earlier, as Casey suggested, there's two sub-watersheds, basically the Big Creek, which is largely contained in one watershed or drainage, and then we have multiple catchments down here that flow into the Middle Fork. And so I'll just go through Gibbs, Jungle, Bear, Hawkins, the Middle Fork through here, Elk Creek, Deep, let's see here, Mosquito, Big, Deadwood, East Fork, Big Creek, which has a very strange shaped watershed for the amount of water that it produces as it flows through that landslide. And then Pizer and Lost. Those are the major catchments. We do things through riparian habitat conservation areas, RHCAs. And so category ones are fish bearing. So there's approximately 85 miles of fish bearing streams within the project area. Perennial water, not fish bearing, 60 miles, and then 60 miles of intermittent or ephemeral channels. And ultimately the wetlands, it constitutes about 1.4% of the overall project area. So something very small in size. Kind of building on Hirsch's discussion about some of the parent material and geology that exists out here, we have a thing called land type associations, and that's what this is kind of picking up. Some of the land types, this is that glaciated area. We had some paraglacial, so glacially influenced, but not necessarily standing ice that have affected some of this upper area. And then these red areas are the landslides. And it's pretty interesting actually, as Big Creek flows through here, one landslide would come across, block up the river, which would erode the opposite side of the toe of the other hill slope, which would induce another landslide on the south side. And so it was almost a revolving pattern of landslide, landslide, landslide. They kind of trigger off of each other. And then as Hirsch also mentioned, we have some other Clarno-induced landsliding in some of the headwaters of these drainages, of Bear as well as Hawkins, that really store that water. And they're critical for that water processing. And then also, there's some incised plateaus where that's more of that Columbia basalt, and we have shallower soils. Runoff tends to be a lot flashier in those types of systems as opposed to some of these others. Right now, there's two things here, precipitation and snow. Here, the Middle Fork flowing through the project area. The headwaters of this side of the watershed gets about 20 to 24 inches of precip. So not nearly the amount of 36 to 40 inch of precip that we get up in the headwaters of Big Creek. And that really dominates, some of those physical inputs dominate those processes that we'll hear about. And then I just kind of did some watershed characteristics for 4 of the watersheds, Deadwood, which is up here, Elk, Bear, and Jungle. And as you can see, the mean elevation decreases. Well, as you do that, so does the mean January precipitation decreases almost by 2 from the Deadwood watershed to Jungle, as well as the mean annual snowfall. It's reduced by more than half. as well as the temperature. And so basically, we're seeing a lot more rain on snow events and more of those characterization conditions on some of these lower elevations than we do over in these areas where it's a lot more snow accumulation, snowpack. And that gets yielded into the hydrograph. And this is some information collected from Division of Water Resources in Oregon. And basically what we see is in May, we see our peak, and it gets down to base flows August, September, October. That's just the characterization of that watershed. And so that all that information, the geology and the physical, those physical inputs yield the energy signature of what Big Creek looks like from the headwaters all the way down to the mouth. And so we break it into different reaches. And so these are the stream survey reaches where data was collected on the habitat properties of Big Creek. And up in here, and so what these numbers represent are the stream slopes of those reaches. And we also talked about it out this past summer, how there's a stair-step pattern and the longitudinal profile. And that's what this is a longitudinal profile. And those glaciated areas, 2.9% slope. Because it was glaciated and the valley was carved out by that ice accumulation. And also right here, this is a major source of sediment supply. Those glaciated conditions created a large amount of sediment as it scoured through that valley. And so that sediment, this is trying to get a profile that's balanced where the energy is being distributed evenly. And so what we see is the geology is controlling it. The landslide's controlling it down in here. This is where the first landslide blocked up Big Creek and it backed up a depositional area, as well as in this area. And that longitudinal profile funnels the sediment through the system, through sediment transport. And this is a diagram of how those processes occur. And our systems are by no means textbook like these, where you have a steep area, which is your source zone of where the sediment's moving out to the ocean. You have this transfer zone, which is like a conveyor belt, where it's just pumping sediment through that system, and it's kind of like a machine, just pushing the sediment through to your depositional areas, your meadows, where that sediment gets deposited on the floodplains, and it helps build it up. And so for Big Mosquito, this is what it looks like. Looking at the different reaches, our source, or our blue areas, our steeper areas, transport, the red, and then the green areas are our depositional environments where that sediment gets deposited. And Middle Fork, a large depositional area. And here is a major, this is the Deadwood, Big Creek area, a large meadow created by those depositional properties, largely from the landslide, but a major water storage area. Here's some of the other meadows that we looked at when we were out there, and I'm going to talk about the condition of some of these resources, such as the headwaters of East Fork Big Creek, just below the landslide scarp. The water table's elevated, great productivity, very limited conifer encroachment. And then there's places like Pizer Meadow, which have had homesteading and other developments for a very long time. There's 2 cabins up at the headwaters of this meadow. And basically, this water is being concentrated right now through very subtle stream channels, which are lowering the water table. And you could see this valley, this meadow, the water table has kind of slowly moved across this meadow floor. And it's wider, and it doesn't have these channel features in some of the other areas of the channel incision that's occurred. And so we're conveying that water off faster. And here's a diagram that I quickly built to conceptually understand what I'm trying to convey is, so here is your surface of the floodplain. You know, here is an undisturbed. So the black is the Earth's surface and the blue is the water table. Basically, it's in contact with the Earth's surface in an undisturbed state. But once you start to get some channel incision in here, you start to get these zones of areas that aren't saturated with the water table, and it allows for conifers to encroach and to get their foot into there, and then they increase some of the transpiration that's occurring of pulling that water through the system and out through the atmosphere. as well as by having this, we're conveying the water off the landscape faster. We're providing for a ditch to move that water from point A to B, rather than a sheet flow where it's spread out and slowly moving downstream. And this can occur on multiple scales. For example, we just had that one in a very small meadow where it is just a couple inches in scale, to some others that are a little bit bigger that I'll share with you in a minute. And this is a Roskin diagram of channel incision. And so what I want to kind of suggest is things are not static, things are dynamic. And that things, as they move through, they're at the surface connected with the floodplain, they downcut. And then if we don't get the structure in there, they'll naturally go through these sequence of events until they get back to a stable, steady state condition. And so there's a myriad of processes in which a stream can take to get to a stable regime or condition. This is Gibbs Meadow, another meadow, part of the Armstrong Creek area. But down in here we have a lot of young conifers that are becoming established on this meadow. And I'm concerned what that would look like in 20 to 50 years if we continue to suppress fire and do other actions. A very subtle channel that's flowing through this meadow that's just out of place. On that larger scale, Macy Meadow, part of that Big Creek Deadwood area, we have lodgepole right up to the edge of the downcut channel that flows through the meadow, and basically that's what it looks like. And there's all kinds of indicators that this is downcut based on incision on the inside of the point bar and lack of depositional features over on the meadow. But ultimately, we're moving this water through these depositional areas faster, off the landscape faster. Switching over to past management activities, here's a map from 1881 that you can find through the University of Oregon on their website, or also with the county courthouse. They have all these files on microfiche. General land orders. So at that time, we're putting in the legal descriptions, towns, townships, range, sections. And so they were inventorying and taking notes of all these different features. And as Kay was suggesting, back in 1881, all of these are different mining claims on Elk Creek. And so this area has been already pretty heavily utilized by that time period. The blue line represents a ditch. This ditch comes off of Big Creek, in which they were taking it over to mine. This ditch comes off of Deadwood, in which they were taking it over to Deep Creek to begin doing some hydraulic mining. This is some of the mining that we've observed in the Deadwood area. This is what a large area looks like. It's kind of difficult to see, but this is some of the ditch that comes in. This was all mined all the way through here. All of these areas were mined. Just really a quick short hike up to check out what some of these areas look like on the condition of some of the things that happened in the past. Also, the Middle Fork John Day also had quite a bit of mining and dredging that had occurred. Here we're looking at Bear Creek with the Middle Fork that flows through on the other side. We've disrupted quite a few physical processes within here. We no longer have a floodplain that can be in contact with the flood waters that come up. It gets trapped in between these areas. And Pat McDowell has done a paper on this, that this system can't fix itself until the next ice age, basically, comes through. And so there's a lot of values of water storage and a lot of physical processes where the channel is no longer in balance with the floodplain, and there's excessive stream power and energy in here that's just excessive. It's pushing all the gravels and other habitat forming features through that system. And the Forest Service tried to put in some V log weirs and rock structures, but these ultimately have been undermined because of the excessive energy that's part of that system. And also, we're not getting some of the processes. There's some good vegetation in here, but we're not really getting that lateral cutting back and forth across the valley, which is ultimately going to create the sites for cottonwood reestablishment and really have the things that are going to provide shade, long-term shade for this reach of river. And it's Here's a LiDAR view of it. Here's Bear Creek flowing through where historically it would meet the Middle Fork. Currently, Bear Creek gets trapped on this side of the tailings before coming out over here. So the length of the tailings that had occurred in here is approximately 2.5 miles with a width of about 700 feet. And there's other tailings that have occurred in the project area, for example, Elk Creek, that we're not proposing to do treatments to, where we don't believe that the values and processes are as being affected as they are here in this Middle Fork piece. Some other management activities are roads and management of this 2090 road. We looked at the densities, but road density is not as big of an issue as the location of the road. And here, the 2090 road going up is right in the valley bottom. And right here, we went out there on a family trip this past spring. On a Sunday, I found a Forest Service excavator out there, and they were ripping out beaver dams because the beaver dams were pushing the water over to the road and were beginning to undermine the road. And so, road's in a bad location. And then further upstream, there's another spot where the road is being undermined by Big Creek, the high energy system that it is, the white water. And ultimately there's one spot where it has failed 2 times in the past 10 years, costing us $20,000 each time to fix. And we measured the length and the width and the depth of that amount of soil, that volume of soil that was eroded, and it was approximately 2,500 tons of road soil. And so that's the size of a football field with 1 foot of sediment each time that road got eroded. That's the amount of soil that was entered into Big Creek and the Middle Fork to fill in the residual pools, to fill in those channels. And so those are the consequences that we have to live with if we're going to continue to maintain this road in its current location. And that's just the character of this stream, Big Creek. It tends to erode against the toe. It tends to get deflected by large wood that falls in and move across its valley because it's such a high energy system. Some other roads, we did a pretty exhaustive road inventory this past summer to really identify where there's problems with roads and where roads are doing good. And this is one area with the smectite clays. As Hirsch mentioned, that ash can really mask a lot of things underneath. And in one area, smectite clays are really greasy. When it gets wet, it's easily eroded, very slippery to drive on type of road. We have some problem location roads that we would like to do some maintenance or improve or come up with some management actions. And then water quality issues. Biocriteria is a new one. It's a 303D listed for deadwood. And that's the diversity of macroinvertebrates that exist. And so they went out to sample, and it didn't meet what the expected would be for that area, and so therefore is listed. Water temperature, TMDL was completed in 2010. It was 303D listed up until then. We placed out some water temperature probes to look at what some of the conditions were on some of these streams. And these are the standards, the green and blue, for bull trout and core cold water temperatures. And basically, this is the Middle Fork flowing through the project area and near the vicinity of the tailings. And then this is Bear Creek. And so I think it was around July 23rd when that temperature spike happened so quickly that there was fish kills on the Middle Fork. They need to go seek refugia in some of these other tributaries. And that's just the importance of connectivity and the colder water that's associated with some of these tributaries and having connected streams. And then also shade. We looked at the Middle Fork and we looked at other areas within the project for shade. And we're having some issues with both cottonwood, willow, and shrub recruitment, and having multiple age classes of shrubs to provide for shade over the long term for these sections. And so we looked at it qualitatively and quantitatively by doing solar pathfinder measurements. For forested conditions, we looked at doing treatments in riparian areas, or RHCAs. And so we came up with a fixed radius plot of about 26 feet and counting each tree, what kind of species it is, grouping them into size classes, and then coring them for age to determine what the ages were. In this one right now, we're going to look at warm, dry riparian forest with the ponderosa pine. And then there was other past harvesting activities which has affected the current condition of some of these RHCAs. And so do we want them to exist in this area or this condition where they're competing against each other and we might have limited shade, or do we want to try to improve those conditions? And so, this is an area where we took pictures of the Solar Pathfinder to determine how much effective shade is occurring at that spot. And because of some of the competition with the trees, we believe that we could provide more shade by doing some opportunities, and we could also potentially improve some of the valley bottom characteristics by adding that wood to some of these stream systems. So here's some results for Gibbs Creek. This is an area that we stopped at for the collaborative trip this past summer. So up here, looking at the basal area of the historic and modern, the historic was pretty much typified by larger size classes than what currently exists right now. The basal area of historic, and historic we define as being stumps and other features that we can see out there on the ground. We came up with a 120, 140, so not much of a departure in the basal area, but the big departure is in trees per acre. So at that time there were a lot less trees, but they were in the larger size classes, and now we have a lot more trees in smaller size classes in a lot of these warm, dry. And we don't believe that would be that way if we had a natural fire regime working through some of these systems. And then Big Creek, more of a cool, moist type of site. Again, pretty similar for the basal area. The big difference is trees per acre, 900 versus 20. And also, the composition and diversity of species has changed pretty dramatically under today's regime. And some literature suggests, these smaller tree sizes, their transpiration rates are a lot higher than some of these larger trees. And so there's more water being sucked out to the atmosphere. And that large wood, that wood would come into large woody debris, and it would provide roughness and structure to the stream, capture sediment, in which it is here on this is Deadwood Creek in one spot. It creates complexities. It induces hyperetic flow paths where that water is being forced through here and actually cools it. And more water storage, and then ultimately cooler water where we have large wood in some of our systems. First, a spot on Bear Creek where it is not. Wide, shallow channel form, so more solar radiation that's occurring, lack of a developed pool riffle sequence, lack of adequate residual pool depths, and ultimately lack of connectivity. And so our stream survey crews collected some data this past summer on these areas, and we have some other data going back to 2001. But we know what the current amount of large wood is per mile for these various streams. And so we can look at that condition and compare it to what some of our standards are. Some other channel stability issues, excessive energy in some of these headwater intermittent channels where they're a sediment source. Same thing. In some of these systems, the lack of coarse woody debris. And so overall conclusion, what's happening? Water's being lost, and it's not being captured at its landscape potential. We have some major meadows, major depositional features that just are not functioning properly right now. Water's ultimately being running off of the landscape faster. Limited meadow storage for late season base flows. So those meadows would decrease and dampen some of that peak flow that we saw in May, and it would increase some of those low base flows that we saw in August, September, October. Limited large wood to slow runoff and store that water. And ultimately our information reflects that these systems are incised, roads or other features constrain them, and they're ultimately simplified. Late season water temperatures warmer than their potential if we had that storage. A lot of these intermittent and other valley bottoms, they're infiltration galleries for water and for snow melt. And we have a loss of storage in the valley bottoms. And as a result, we have a change in the plant community. Where we stopped on Gibbs Creek, one example where we have an incised valley bottom, snowberry is really taking over that. And snowberries to me is more of a xeric type of plant, a dried out indicator. And we could get more forage, we could get more grasses, more of a historic species composition, as well as more shrubs and hardwoods. There's birch, there's alder in some of these systems, and the biomass and leaf fall that comes off of that helps build soils and helps water storage even more. And so we have a deficiency in that across the landscape. And so overall, what does this really mean? We have less water for trees and forage, as well as reduced habitat for fish, and both extent and the quality of that habitat. And we believe that if we were to develop a restoration package, we could help offset some of these with the information that we have for the project area. And so now we'll hear more about the fish habitat aspects.